We're back with another fascinating look at some of the more obscure but still influential episodes from medieval history. Today, I want to take a few minutes to look at medieval forgeries. I don't know about you, but I've been shocked to discover the extent to which it is admitted historical forgeries have been used over the years. Conversely, imagine if you had the power to declare an authentic document a forgery, and a forgery authentic. Another thing to keep in mind is that history only became a scientific field of study very recently. In 1902, J.B. Bury, an English historian, gave his inaugural lecture at Cambridge, and I quote, "I may remind you that history is not a branch of literature." In fact, the pioneer of critical historical science is considered to be a German historian, Leopold von Ranke, who died at 90 in 1886. He said, "I see the time approaching when we shall base modern history no longer on the reports of contemporary historians, except insofar as they were in the possession of personal and immediate knowledge of facts, and still less on work yet more remote from the source, but rather on the narratives of eyewitnesses and on genuine and original documents." Ranke believed that every period of history is unique and must be understood in its own context. He rejected the approach to history that each period is considered inferior to the period which follows. In other words, the Dark Ages were not inferior to the Middle Ages, and Middle Ages were not inferior to the Renaissance. Merely different. He also thought that history was not to be an account of man's progress, and that history is no criminal court. He's most famous for the quote, "To history has been assigned the office of judging the past, of instructing the present for the benefit of future ages. To such high offices this work does not aspire, it wants only to show what actually happened." What were we talking about again? Oh yeah, medieval forgeries. The reason I mentioned Ranke is because of his emphasis on primary sources. As such, a forgery of a primary source would be the most persuasive and influential. So, for our first forgery, let's discuss the donation of Constantine after the intro. We're back. The donation of Constantine. Perhaps you've heard of it. The story goes like this. Pope Sylvester cures the Emperor of Rome of leprosy. The Emperor of Rome at this time is of course based in what we now call Byzantium. In return, Constantine, the Emperor, declares Rome to be of crucial importance to the Church because it is the city of the apostles, specifically Peter and Paul. But that's not all. He also bestows papal supremacy over the principal sees of Christianity: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem, and all the world's churches to boot. Wow, Constantine sure knows how to pay back a favor. That's not all though. Constantine gives the Pope control of the imperial palace in Rome, and control of all the regions of the Western Roman Empire. In other words, the Pope now has the power to appoint kings. Pick your jaw off the floor because the document was a forgery. It never happened. No miraculous curing of leprosy. No generous donation. no right for the Pope in the city of Rome to name kings in the Western Roman Empire. Hey, if you're going to forge something, you might as well go big. Now, it is not easy to uncover the truth of when the donation of Constantine was actually written. It is of course claimed that it was a donation by Constantine to Pope Sylvester, which would place it in the 4th century AD. But it was used in the 13th century in support of the papacy's claims to political authority. To understand why this is important, you have to understand a little bit about medieval power structures. Now, I'm going to generalize a little bit, so don't take what I'm saying to be true of all places at all times, but generally speaking, you had two main power structures: the civil power structure and the military power structure. Merchants were outside of these structures, but still subordinate to them and greatly lacking in prestige. A king was in charge of the military power structure, which meant that if he was gathering an army, you had to do your part. Bishops, archbishops, patriarchs, and the Pope were in charge of the civil power structure. To them, you owed a tithe, a tenth of your income. If you were emperor, that effectively meant you were in charge of both power structures, civil and military. So you can see now the donation of Constantine was a way of trying to make the Pope into a sort of emperor. Here's the important part. The document was considered legitimate, at least in Western Europe, until well into the 15th century. Around 1450, about when the Ottoman Empire was firmly setting its sights on turning Constantinople into Istanbul, a Catholic priest named Lorenzo Valla was able to prove that the document could not be real due to its use of anachronistic Latin. He was also adamant that the forgery was so obvious that the church had knowledge that the document was inauthentic. From this point on, the Catholic Church claimed their lands were donated to them by Charlemagne, and that their authority, the keys to heaven, were given to them by Saint Peter. Now, what is interesting to me is that the treatise written by Valla that showed the donation to be a forgery was placed on a list of banned books a century after its publication. And it was still accepted as authentic, the donation was still accepted as authentic until around 1600 AD. Even in the 18th century, a German philosopher, Christian Wolff, alluded to it as fact. So the donation of Constantine was used politically for over 300 years, despite being shown to be a forgery. That is very telling, and it would be foolish of us to think that that sort of thing could have happened in the past, but not these days. The next prominent medieval forgeries I want to discuss are the only slightly less interesting pseudo-Isidorian decretals. The donation of Constantine was actually contained within this collection of forged letters. But before we continue, a word from our sponsors. Conquest of Truth, my first work of fiction, a story from the earliest days of gunpowder weapons. In 1302, following the mysterious death of his father, the Duke of Styria, and grandfather, Rudolph, King of the Romans, Johann, just 12 years old, is forced to flee the Holy Roman Empire. Entrusted with a terrible secret by loyal Cistercian monks, Johann must solve the murder, become a man, and plot the destruction of the men responsible. Not only will you enjoy it, you just might learn something. Check it out. Where were we? Yes, the decretals of Pseudo-Isidore. The important aspect of this forgery is that it was contained within genuine material. This immediately raises the question for me, Who decides where the genuine material stops and the forgery begins? It appears there were different versions of the forged documents, and these were divided into a number of groups, which made it difficult to determine which group is the genuine forgery. That's a strange way to phrase it, if you ask me. It appears that the forgers originally circulated their work in several different versions to evade detection. The forgeries seem to have focused on legislation and criminal procedure. What was the point? It seems the author's goal was to make bishops answerable to the Pope, not to the Holy Roman Emperor. Why is that important? Well, my guess would be that not only did the bishops have great influence, they also had, in most cases, great wealth. On top of that, it would appear that determining under whose jurisdiction they were would determine not just who got a share of the proceeds they collected, but when they died, who could replace them. That is, the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, in most cases, these offices were sold to the highest bidder. You weren't merely appointed as a bishop. This is what simony and the investiture controversy were all about. Now, although these documents were important in the 11th and 12th century, they were not shown to be forgeries until the mid-15th century, and basically proven as forgeries around 1630 AD. Next up, we have the alleged forger, Przemysław Diamentowski. Any Polish viewers? Feel free to correct my pronunciation on that. Now, Przemysław lived in the early 18th century, and he was a prolific writer, said to be the author of the Slavic Sarmatian Chronicle of Prokos. This was used to provide the earliest known reference to Poland as a nation, and was also used to provide a connection between the Poles and Sarmatians. Now, the Sarmatians are often credited with developing heavily armored combat on horseback, also known as knights. Przemysław also suggested that the Poles were connected to India. The purpose of this kind of alleged forgery is usually to deal with modern political realities. In this case, whether Poles should be friends with Germany and Russia, enemies with Germany and Russia, or some combination of the two. We could keep going on this topic for quite some time, and maybe we will revisit it in the future. But lastly, I want to talk about Annius of Viterbo. He was a monk of the Dominican order who lived from 1432 to 1502. Well, in 1493, right around when Columbus was busy discovering the New World, he found a number of marble statues of legendary figures associated with Viterbo. He also wrote a number of documents, it seems the purpose of which were to magnify the importance of his own family, that of Viterbo, and also the Etruscan people. A topic for another day. He considered the people of Viterbo and those of Tuscany to be the custodian of the original knowledge of divine nature, and to play a leading role in the march of man towards the future. Now, what is interesting to me about Annius of Viterbo is that his forgeries were exposed by one Joseph Justus Scaliger, a famous name to anyone who has studied chronology or read the work of Anatoly Fomenko. And to put it briefly, not someone who was free of accusations of forgery himself. Maybe that was how Scaliger was able to detect the forgeries. But that about covers it for today. What did we learn? Well, that sometimes people go to great lengths to influence history. Keep in mind, these are only cases of high-profile, documented forgery. If we were talking about scholars and historians who merely reinterpreted and recontextualized history, such as Karl Marx or the later Frankfurt School, we would be here all day. I hope you enjoyed this video. Smash that like button, and in my conquest of YouTube's algorithm, hit that subscribe and tune in next time for the next episode of Critical History. Until then, you know what to do. Stay critical.